Dear friends, good morning on Monday the 4th of May, another week in lockdown land. For most of the 41 days of lockdown, my daily Bible readings have been from the book of Jeremiah. I was rather dreading reading through Jeremiah, I have to say, thinking that it was going to be full of doom and gloom and it would rather depress me. But I couldn't have been more wrong. God knows what he is doing. He has fed me richly from his ancient prophet. And it's really helping me to cope with the lockdown time. So I thought this week I would share a little bit of what I've been learning from Jeremiah by just looking at chapter 29. Now, Jeremiah ministered between 626 and 527 BC. He prophesied from the city of Jerusalem, where most of the population had been deported to Babylon. In chapter 29, he writes a letter to the exiles in Babylon, giving them advice on how to remain faithful to God in an alien land and situation. And much of what he says is relevant to us during our exile, during lockdown. This is what he says in verses 4 to 6 of Jeremiah 29. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. One of the temptations for us under lockdown, and especially as it continues without any clear roadmap in sight as to how this is going to end, is to hunker down in our homes, becoming more and more isolated from anybody else until the restrictions are lifted. The temptation for the exiles in Babylon was similar. Let's just keep our heads down, keep away from anybody else, not bother to plant crops or have children, and wait until we're allowed home to do anything productive. Jeremiah's advice is much more positive. He sees that God is behind the exile from Jerusalem, and he has his purposes for the exiles even in Babylon. The first thing he tells them to do is to continue with normal life as much as they possibly can. In particular, they are to continue with family life and to increase in number in exile. Now, I'm not recommending a baby boom during lockdown, but our first priority is to care for our families. This will be much easier for some than others. For some families with very little space, with no garden or access to outside areas, the lockdown is incredibly challenging. In other families, homeschooling is stressful and tempers are fraying. We know that there is an alarming rise in domestic violence, and some children are at real risk. Some households are running out of money and are becoming dependent on food banks. Many families are separated from their older relatives who are having to isolate themselves, and some have experienced the unbearable grief of losing loved ones to the virus and being unable to be with them in their final hours. So the challenges for families are huge, and none of us are unaffected by them. But despite all this, we are to try and make homes and gardens, if we have them, places of sanctuary and productivity for our families. We're to try to settle down into the new normal for as long as we are in exile, and we're to continue with family life as much as we are able to. In the church family, we have a responsibility for our wider family, for Jesus makes it clear that we are brothers and sisters in Christ. There may well be things that we can do for each other to make family life more bearable in exile. And beyond our church family, there might well be friends and neighbours that we can support from our own produce or resources. What might it mean for you to settle down during this time of exile? How can you and your family be productive during this time? How can you help and support the wider church family or those around you? Make sure that the time of exile is productive and proactive. God bless you this week.